Broken Scar was burning. He found himself standing in the square, surrounded by roaring flames and the shrieks of panicked Dwarrow, while the sky boiled an angry crimson in the blaze. His eyes stung, tears and smoke burning in his vision as he stumbled down the boulevard, struggling to make out anything through the deluge of fire that seemed to devour the life he had known without mercy or restraint.
"Mother?"
he cried out.
"Uncle Ard?"
But nobody was coming. He stood amid the wreckage and wept for help, but he was completely alone. Until the instant that he wasn't. A shape loomed in the darkness, a massive shape that carried with it a sense of tremendous dread. Thunder boomed overhead, and the flames surrounding him sizzled as a warm, gentle rain began to fall. He felt the drops against his skin, and when he lifted his hand to wipe at his streaming eyes again, his fingers came away sticky and red. The figure that loomed in the fire was too large to ignore. All around him, though he could hear the cries and wails of his fellow Dwarrow, he could not see any of them. What he could see were more shapes, flitting in the smoke and rain, so much bigger than men, but moving with a terrible grace and predatory speed around him. It was impossible to tell how many there were, as they faded in and out of view, but he knew they were watching him, hunting him. The silhouette that loomed large just before him did not bother to conceal itself. He heard a sound like a heavy war drum, like stones clattering against the cobbles of the road in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was like the hoofbeats of a horse, but no horse could ever be this massive. No horse could bear a rider so awful in its stultifying hideousness. White cloth billowed, the graven wraps of some long-buried thing, now risen and animate long past the time it should have lain down to rot with the rest of the dead. It was a great stag, one of the fabled mounts of the troll folk, thin and skeletal, yet quivering with unimaginable power at every movement. Step by ponderous step, it lurched its way out of the smoke to stand before him, bearing its awful rider, and he beheld a hand shod in steel that lazily gripped one of the enormous antlers and steered the mount. In its other hand, where the bare flesh could be seen, gray and mottled like a corpse, it held a hammer. A hammer like the sort he had seen workmen use before to break down old houses to make way for the construction of something new. A huge sledge, a maul, the likes of which he had never imagined existing, hung easily in the grasp of this dread rider. And even as he stood, paralyzed in front of it, he felt his own will crumbling and fading. A shock ran through his body as his knees met the ground, and the vile iron hand tilted its cowled head towards him as its mount drew abreast. Cracked, dry lips parted, revealing a mouth containing long, needle teeth, and a sour, rancid breath that stank of copper washed over him. He quailed before it, knowing that any moment now the iron hand would tear off his skin to replace what it itself had lost long, long ago. It would glut upon his blood and satisfy its endless thirst by tearing him open and slurping up the raw red ichor that spilled from within his broken cadaver. He could not scream, could not move. Where was his mother? Where was his uncle, his brother, Piero? Where was anybody?
"Co? Hey, Co, are you asleep?"
The voice sounded incredulous, disbelieving. Someone was shaking him by the shoulders, and with a start, Co shuddered awake. He was not standing in the ruined square of Broken Scar, and he was certainly not alone. as if he had just lifted his head out from underwater. The roarsome noise of the tavern washed over him, and he very nearly started out of his chair as he jolted into wakefulness. Paolo was shaking him, bouncing in his own seat, and looking excitedly between Ko and the row of onlookers that formed an open circle of space in the center of the alehouse.
There you are! I can't believe you nodded off during the biggest fight of the season!
Ko rubbed his eyes and wondered how he could have ever dozed off in the middle of a din like this. He did his best to shut out his brother's elated cheering as he gazed at the two figures locked in one another's arms in the center of the makeshift ring.
How is he faring?
He yelled to Paolo, though he had to repeat it a few times before he got any kind of answer.
It's Piero. We all know the only reason it's gone on this long is because he's too nice to go all out.
Ko pursed his lips and took another look. Piero's mane of crimson hair wasn't hard to identify, nor was his truly enormous frame, and in fact he was so much larger than the man he was fighting that for just an instant it looked like he was wrestling himself. Ko knew the other man by sight, though they had never spoken. Truth be told, it was more than a little odd for children like them to be in a place like this, keeping company like this. The one knew that their mother would certainly not approve, but as long as they were with Piero, and technically they still were by Paolo's reasoning, they had free reign of the village. Drek, Piero's opponent, seemed a decent fellow, though a bit gruff and surly whenever youngsters were involved, and everyone knew that this was more a friendly bout than any kind of feud between the miller and the riverman. Piero had been the undisputed champion of Broken Scar's pugilist circles for as long as Ko could remember, and while plenty of men had struck up enough bravado to challenge him for the title, nobody had yet ousted him. Being half-troll gave the stout miller something of an unfair advantage, Ko thought, but he was hardly complaining. Paolo had swiped a handful of florins from their uncle's room before they left the house, and had bet all of it on Piero to win. At the very least, Ko hoped that they could break even on the investment, and Ard would never need to know that they'd been snooping in his quarters. Piero, seemingly tireless despite the match having gone on for what felt like several dozen minutes, finally appeared to grow weary of the bout, and bucked his way out of Drek's headlock, before trapping the other man's arm at the wrist and elbow, and holding him, helpless at the half-troll's mercy. The referee, another Dwarrow whom Ko did not know the name of, began to count, and though Drek struggled fiercely, everybody knew that it was just about over. Piero had, as everyone had expected, won again. His supporters, a good few field hands, businessmen from town, and a very large swath of women, cheered for him as the referee shouted his victory. Piero, grinning sheepishly, gripped Drek's hand and lifted it high, giving proper honors to his opponent, who nodded curtly at him but did not return his smile.
Yes!
Paolo pumped his fist in the air excitedly.
Pay up, gentlemen.
He stood up on his chair and turned to face the group of riverboatmen who had been sitting behind him, all of whom had wagered on their man, Drek. None of them appeared very happy to have to give up their hard-earned wages to a child who could only look them in the eyes while standing on top of a chair, and Ko was starting to feel nervous about the dark looks they were getting. One of the men stepped forward, a very shady-looking Dwarrow with a few missing fingers and a very long knife in his belt.
Not a fair bout, though, was it, boyo? Never mentioned back on the quay that your man was twice the size of a house and stronger than an ox with a bad temper, did ya?
Paolo shrugged.
Everybody in Broken Scar and all the land surrounding knows about Half-Troll Piero. It isn't my fault that you were so poorly informed. And besides, a deal is a deal, and it's all in good fun. If your man had won, I'd have happily forked over my bet.
The rivermen exchanged looks with his fellows, and their leader rested his hand on his knife hilt. Most of the onlookers, local folk who knew Paolo and Ko by name and by reputation, were too busy celebrating or chatting or drinking to notice the two children and their standoff with a large group of out-of-towners, and now Ko's stomach dropped.
Paul, maybe just drop it. It isn't like we need the money or anything.
He reached out to grab his brother's shoulder, but Paolo shook him off with a disbelieving smirk.
No. They agreed to the bet when we met on the quay, and we shook on it like men, didn't we?
These guys are bad news, Paul, Ko muttered, leaning into his brother's ear and trying to pull him down off his chair.
And we really should be going anyways. We will, just as soon as everybody's square. Money was on the table, boys. Let's not be poor sports now.
Only boy I see here is you, little man, the three-fingered Dwarrow smirked. And you ought to listen to your sister. Brother, Ko corrected, annoyed, but said nothing else. His hand strayed towards his sling, wrapped around his waist as a belt. Paul was supposed to have his with him as well, but had forgotten it back at home when they had left for the day. Ko was hardly a masterful shot with his own sling, having practiced less ardently as most other boys his age. But they were indoors, and it was the only thing he was carrying that could be used to defend himself in a pinch. Before anyone could do anything else, a jovial voice cut through the tension in the air, and Ko felt a burly arm drape over his shoulder as Piero made his way into their midst. "Quite the bout your man Drek gave me, fellows." He laughed heartily, and Ko let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. "He very nearly had the run of things towards the end there. Hope you hadn't bet too much on him to win." The three-fingered Dwarrow moved his hand hurriedly away from his knife hilt, and instead hooked his thumbs into the waist of his trousers, muttering something about a fair bout that Ko couldn't catch. "Anyhow, no need to be sore losers. Come on. A round for the lot of you. On me, to celebrate a well-done bit of wrestling. Oh, and don't worry about paying off these little scamps." At this, Piero gave both boys a sidelong glance that said, "Do not speak a word," and both Paolo and Ko clammed up without objection. "They're always trying to pull the wool over on out-of-towners. Boys will be boys and all that. I say whatever wager they swindled you into, we can consider null. What do you say?" Piero beamed at the men, who looked at each other with a good deal more cheer in their faces, and they quickly took up the reigning champion of Broken Scar on his offer. The alehouse erupted into more cheering and good-natured singing, as Piero directed them away from Pole and Co., staying behind and arching an eyebrow at the two boys.
"All right, before you get angry,"
Pole started. "Angry? I'm not the one who's going to be angry, Paolo. You can count on that," Piero returned, gripping both boys by the shoulders and steering them towards the exit. "Do you have any idea what your mother would do to me if she found out that you had been here? Especially consorting with those rivermen. Have you lost your wits?"
"It was just a little bit of easy-going betting," Paolo wheedled. "It isn't my fault they were such sore losers about it."
"It's your fault for getting yourselves involved," Piero admonished him, tweaking the boy's ear lightly as they stepped out into the late afternoon sunshine.
"And where did you even get the money to lay down on the wager? Did you have any at all? What was your plan if I hadn't won the match?" "Now, come on, Piero. Everyone in town knew you were going to beat him. Nobody so much as pinned you for as long as I can remember."
"That's hardly the point, and you know it. Your mother and uncle have both made it very, very clear that you two aren't to be gallivanting around the town unless you're with them. And certainly you aren't supposed to be going anywhere near the quay while the river is filling up."
"Well, we weren't by ourselves, technically," Ko piped up. "You were with us, and Uncle Ard says he trusts you more than anybody else in Broken Scar. And besides, there's never been this many boats going down the river before. Not since the tunnel was dug under the hill. We had to go and see what all the fuss was about."
Piero was silent at that, probably thinking about the recent river traffic as well. Over the past few years, while Pole and Co. had been growing from little children into the young boys they were now, Broken Scar had undergone some significant development, not the least of which was under the jurisdiction of their uncle. Trade coming down the river had picked up since the massive tunnel had been dug through the side of the hill, allowing for riverboats to pass straight beneath the hilltop, without the crews having to disembark and roll their boats along on logs to get past the hillside. It had been good for trade and good for the town, but in the past few weeks the number of boats coming down the river had grown more and more, not just bearing tradesmen, but also straggling travelers and refugees who claimed to be fleeing a terrible disturbance from the north. They never seemed to stay in town long, instead making their way south to the coast, as far from the northern borders of the Dwarrow country as they could get. But what it was they were fleeing from was never a consistent story, Piero stopped herding the children along, and Ko looked up to see a familiar figure waiting at the side of the road, with arms folded and a stern look on his face. "Well, looks like we got you out of there just in the nick of time," Piero muttered. "Seems Ard must have sent for you two. Now look, I won't tell anybody what kind of trouble you got into so long as you promise me you won't ever do it again, all right? I don't want Colette to skin me the next time I come over to the old manor for dinner. Understand?" Yeah. Pole spoke glumly while looking at his shoes, and Ko could guess why. If their Uncle Ard had sent Thel to come and collect them, it was very likely that he had noticed the coin they'd swiped from his quarters, and now they hadn't even gotten any profits from the theft to try and soften the blow. Ko could practically feel the switch on his backside even now, just thinking about what their mother would say. "Boys." Thel nodded curtly at them as Piero delivered the children into the custody of their family's chief servant, and both Pole and Ko gave the burly miller a half-hearted wave as he turned to make his way back to the alehouse. "Bye, Piero. Will we see you at supper time?" Pole called out. "We'll see," Piero tossed over his shoulder. "I may be late. I've an errand to run at the baker's this evening." "We'll save a plate for you," Pole shouted back, and Ko saw his angle already. Supper would be less tense, and there would be less chance of an earful over the meal if the family had a guest over. Piero was the sort of fellow who lifted everybody's spirits whenever he visited, and there was at least a tiny chance that their punishment for this little infraction would be lessened in severity after the half-troll had been to visit. That was Pole, all right. Always scheming something or other, always looking to find the angles and play things to his advantage. He had been like that ever since they had been little. Too clever by half, as folks would say. Ko was, by every metric, more well-read and educated for his age, being the one of the two boys who actually tried to pay attention during his lessons, but he often felt as though his brother was a good deal smarter than he was without even having to try. They fell into step beside Thel as he guided them out of town and down the track that would lead back towards the old manor. There wasn't much for conversation right away, although with Thel there never was. He must have been taught that a servant should be seen and not heard, and he certainly took the lesson to heart, as Ko could count the times he had heard Thel utter more than a single sentence at a time on one hand. He seemed more content to listen and observe the goings-on of the family, and respond accordingly rather than make himself known, a habit which did little to popularize him in town, but made him indispensable to Colette and Ard. "So, are we in trouble?" Pole eventually asked, giving Thel a sidelong glance. Thel replied. Ko had learned to interpret his taciturn grunts over the years, and understood that Thel either didn't know the answer to that, wasn't at liberty to say, or had something else very important on his mind. "I mean, it isn't like anything really happened. We were just with Piero, that's all," Pole argued, despite the fact that nothing had been said. Thel glanced down at him and raised an eyebrow quizzically. "That's so," he replied, and Ko could tell that there wasn't going to be any way for Pole to talk them out of this one, no matter how charming or how honeyed his words were. Their mother was going to punish them something awful. "Well, okay, we were at the alehouse, and I know we aren't really supposed to go in there, but like I said, Piero was with us, and he's the strongest, biggest, friendliest guy in town. Nobody was going to mess with us as long as we were with him. Really, there wasn't anything to worry about at all. Even if there was, we've got our slings with us." "One of us does anyways," Ko muttered, but nobody seemed to hear. "So, I don't think there was any real cause for alarm, not if you think about it." "If you say so," Thel replied evenly, and did not elaborate. The rest of the walk was more of the same, Pole doing everything he could to try and explain away what had happened and spin it in such a way as to minimize the trouble both boys were about to be in, as if Thel had any sway in whether or not they were going to be punished for it. Ko was more resigned to his fate. He had known that this was a bad idea as soon as his brother had suggested it, but as was often the case, he had gone along with Paolo's plan out of a combination of curiosity, a sense of adventure, and the recognition that Pole was going to do what he wanted with or without Ko, and that he had better tag along to try and make sure his brother actually survived what he was about to do. It wouldn't lessen the trouble he was going to be in with their mother to claim he had been acting in Pole's best interests, but this was hardly the first time both boys had gotten into trouble before. As As the manor loomed in the distance, and the time between them and confrontation with their mother and uncle drew nearer, even Pole started to clam up and stop talking so incessantly. Thel marched forwards, and they marched along with him, though as they drew closer to the house, Ko could hear what sounded like an angry shout through one of the open windows. Thel stopped them just as they reached the stepping stone path that led up to the front door of the old manor. Piero had once told them that his father had lovingly laid those stones when he had first built the house for Piero's troll mother, and each stone had at one point been engraved with little stanzas of poetry, though time and dozens of feet had worn them smooth. "Wait," Thel ordered briskly. "I will inform Lady Colliette that we have returned." With that, he turned from the boys and headed up the stepping stones to the front door, where he opened it and walked inside. "Don't you dare try to justify it to me, Their mother's furious voice was cut off as Thel shut the door behind him, and Pole and Co exchanged worried looks. Mother was generally never shouting before they had even arrived at home to be scolded, and if she and their uncle were arguing again, it could only mean trouble. "Come on," Pole said determinedly, waving Co to follow him as he skirted from the path around the side of the manor, searching for the open kitchen window where he would have an easier time hearing what was being said. "Thel said to wait here," Co advised, unmoving, though he too was curious as to what they were arguing about this time. Mother and Uncle Ard seemed to butt heads on almost every single aspect of life here in Broken Scar, to the point where Co often had to wonder why their absent father had even bothered to send their uncle to live with them, if Mother was so very averse to his presence. "Thel's just a servant. He can't boss us around," Pole scoffed. "And besides, I'm not going far. Just to have a quick listen. We'll be back at the path by the time he comes back to get us. Don't you think it would be better to know what we're getting into before Mother has a chance to get the switch?" Co sighed, once again realizing that Pole was not to be dissuaded, and ambled along behind his brother, who was half crouched as he snuck along the side of the house, as if bending over while he walked would somehow make him less visible to anyone watching. The two boys flattened themselves against the outside wall of the manor as they drew near to the open window, and from inside they could still hear their mother's agitated voice. 10 years, Ardax, 10 bloody years I have done what your father asked of us, and I have put up with all manner of humiliations while I waited for word to come back that we could finally go home." Paolo and Co exchanged looks. Ardax? That was an honorific generally reserved for members of royalty up in Urnholm, not for the children of merchants like them. Co furrowed his brow. Perhaps he had misheard, but then Pole had seemingly heard the same exact thing. They leaned in closer to the window. Ard said something in response, but his voice was too low, even for them to make out what it was. Colliette let out an exasperated and very unladylike snort in response. "Did you know that my husband has sent me a letter every single month since we've been gone? Every single month for the last 10 years, a letter has been all I've gotten to remember my husband by, the father of my children. One letter. And now suddenly we haven't received one. In 10 years he has never failed to write to me, and you don't believe that something is very wrong? Dozens of refugees coming down the river, Ardact. I think it's very clear what has happened." Another murmured reply from their uncle, and this time Pole and Co wordlessly conferred with one another. They had most certainly not misheard their mother. Ardax was what she had called their uncle. Co could already begin to put the pieces together, but the picture that they formed was too unbelievable to be true. That is, until their mother made her next point. "My sons are not village boys, commoners, and pretending that they are hurts their future prospects, regardless of what your father has ordered of you. Either Paulax or Coax will lead our people one day as king. You've known that since we arrived here, and yet you hold their heritage hostage from them and demand that I do the same. Is it bitterness? Envy, Ardax? That my sons are next in line to the throne before you? Oh yes, thank you, Thel, dear." At that, both Pole and Co should have left their hiding place and headed back around to the front of the house to await their invitation inside to be reprimanded. But neither boy seemed able to move, struck dumb as if by lightning, by the revelation of what they had overheard. Ko couldn't think straight, as if he was swimming in a boat full of gravy inside his own head, and his thoughts were connecting so much slower than they ought to have done. Coax, she called me. My mother called me Coax. Did you hear what I heard? Pole hissed at him, his eyes gone as wide as dinner plates and sparkling with intrigue. I knew we were special, Ko. I always knew it. We're princes. We must have come down from the capital back when we were first born. I wonder why. Ko couldn't seem to bring himself to be as excited as his brother. More so, he felt a sudden pressure dropping down onto his shoulders, a weight that he did not wish to carry. This had to be some sort of a jest, right? Maybe their mother knew that they were outside eavesdropping and was just trying to trick them. Or maybe they were misunderstanding the context of the conversation between their mother and uncle. She had used royal honorifics in their names, said that they were destined to rule as king one day. This life was all Ko had ever known, and while it had been made clear to him ever since he was a baby that Broken Scar was not where he came from, it still felt like home. Their mother had made a fuss about returning to Earnholm for as long as he could remember, but actually doing it seemed more like a pipe dream, something to be talked about longingly but never acted upon. Now the fear of uncertainty weighed on his mind, and he remained silent and thoughtful as Thel came round the side of the house to find the little eavesdroppers struck dumb where they hid. I see, the servant said evenly as he appeared to have realized what had just happened. Well, it was bound to happen sooner or later. Come along. Neither of the boys moved, both slumped against the side of the house, dumbfounded. Ko heard Thel walking away, apparently unheeding of the fact that he wasn't being followed, but the boy's mind was too busy racing. How could this be? How could nobody have told them their whole lives? Were they actually something more than the sons of an absentee merchant back in Earnholm? Was their father the heir to the throne of all Dwarrow? Were they the heirs to that throne now? And if they were, which one of them would be expected to take on the responsibility? Ko looked over at his brother, who wore a goofy, dumbfounded grin on his face as he sat beside the window. Paolo was lost in the novelty of the revelation, he realized, far too busy considering the good to even recognize the bad. Ko couldn't seem to see any benefits at all. They had been lied to, their entire lives. Uncle Ard, or Ardax, or whatever his name was royalty. And so were they, apparently, though nobody had bothered to tell them. Ko had never thought much about how he wanted to spend his life once he grew up. For a child, that thought was far off in the distance, and not something worth thinking about as more than a passing fancy. But Ko knew a few things, and one of them was that he did not wish to lead. He certainly didn't feel as though he had the predilection for it. He had always been content to follow in Pole's footsteps, watching and taking note of all that transpired, offering his thoughts when they became relevant, but never the center of attention. This was not what he wanted. He heard Thel re-entering the kitchen through the open window, and then the sound of his mother suddenly drawing in breath. They're what? What did they hear? Another soft reply from the servant, and the sound of their uncle sighing deeply before their mother's voice cut through the afternoon like a knife. Boys! Inside! Now! The smile slipped off of Paolo's face, and Ko set his mouth on a firm line. In this moment, even his nightmare from earlier this afternoon would have been preferable to the ire of his mother, but there was nothing much for it. Besides, he had questions of his own, and he was very much interested in finding out more about what else had been kept from him. Ooh, sounds like she's in poor spirits, said Piero from just behind them. Maybe you two ought to get in there before she gets any madder. Ko, startled, leapt up, tripped over his own feet, and nearly tumbled right back down into the dirt. Piero? What are you doing here? My business in town wasn't quite so pressing as I thought it might be, and I didn't want you two to be chewed out too badly by Lady Colliette. After all, nothing really came of it, and I know you won't do anything like you did today again. You're smart boys. She usually takes it easier on you when I'm around, so I thought I'd stop by.
Paul and Co. exchanged looks again. Did you hear what she... Did you know about... The two boys asked in unison, both questions drowning each other out. Was Piero in the dark about all of this too? About the truth of who they were and where they came from? Or had he known all along just like their mother had? With how honest and guileless of a man the half-troll was, Co rather doubted that he could have kept that kind of secret for very long. But then, did that mean that their uncle had lied to his own very best friend as well? For all these years? Piero's face grew concerned as he saw that the two children were more distressed about something else than their mother scolding them. Hey now, what's the matter with you two? I know she can be a little frightening, but your mother's not going to bite your heads off or anything, no matter how angry she is. You didn't hear? Paul asked lamely, eyes wide. Hear what? Have you two been eavesdropping out here? The miller's face grew deeply concerned, and Co had to assume that he really didn't know the truth. Boys! Their mother's voice barked out again from the kitchen, and Co heard her footsteps approaching the window. I know you two little rascals are hiding out there. Now listen to me when I'm speaking to you and get yourselves inside before I... Oh! Piero! Colliette appeared suddenly shocked to see the miller standing outside with her sons just beyond the threshold of the house. Evening, Miss Colliette. I hope I'm not intruding. I just thought I'd stop by to see how you folks were getting by for supper, or if I might interest you in a few fresh loaves. As Piero spoke, Co noticed for the first time the cheesecloth-wrapped bundle he was carrying that smelled of newly baked bread. He must have come along after them right after picking those up from the baker's. Yes, of course, Piero. You know you're always welcome. How long exactly were you standing out there? Oh, not long, Piero laughed. I only just arrived to see these two little ne'er-do-wells sneaking along outside the kitchen windows. Co felt the sudden and irresistible urge to blurt out everything that he had learned, to tell Piero everything that their mother and Uncle Art had hidden from them, but he did his best to fight it. As much as it stung to learn that he had been lied to, the sensible side of Co's mind knew that their mother and uncle did not do things without a good reason, and now that he thought about it, if they were really royals, what could have caused them to flee Ernholm and not return in 10 whole years? Maybe it was dangerous for them to be found out down here in the countryside. On the other hand, this was only Piero, their friend Piero, who had given them this house to live in out of the goodness of his own heart. Surely they could trust him, couldn't they? Glancing at Paolo, Co saw that his brother was wrestling with the very same conundrum that he was, and the longer he tried to hold the words in, the more desperately they tried to blurt out of his mouth. Even as his mother and Piero continued to talk through the window, he wrestled with himself over what to do. The choice is yours.